And Applebaum, can I ask you to come to the podium? We won't be needing the lectern, I think. Just by way of short introduction, a little bit again. You wrote already for over, well, almost 3 decades now. You're writing on issues on the Soviet Union.
Don't remind me how old I am.
That's yeah. Well, but
2.5 decades.
You don't look the part, but but you have been writing extensively on Gulag, a history and the crushing of Eastern Europe. You won a Pulitzer Prize for one of those that's just been mentioned. You wrote a travel log. We asked you to speak a little bit beforehand, but before, just one question before that: how come you became so interested in that part of the world? What was the reason for that? The first.
First of all, thank you for being here. I'm always delighted to be in the Netherlands. And before I answer that question, which I will do, I will preface it by explaining why I'm here today. I'm not publishing a book right now. I do hope to be publishing one soon. It happens to be about Ukraine, and I started writing it before the crisis, and the crisis has now delayed the publication of the book. I'm not promoting a book. I'm not Ukrainian. I don't work for anybody in Ukraine. I'm not a lobbyist. But I am here because the story of the Dutch referendum and the way that the politics around the referendum are developing in Ukraine are to me so outrageous and so shocking that I accepted the invitation to come here and speak about it. And this is connected to what originally interested me in the region. I've been, as you say, I have been writing on and working on studying former communist Europe since the 1980s. I studied Russian when I was at university. I don't have an East European background myself, but I was drawn to the story of totalitarianism, an attempt in the 1980s, in an attempt to understand what it was, in the 1990s to understand how it was unraveling. I have lived in Poland. I have spent enormous amount of time in Russia, more recently in Ukraine, watching those countries try to cope with the terrible legacy of the past. It's a legacy of dictatorship, forced starvation, concentration camps, war, the Holocaust, really nearly every trauma of the 20th century that you can think of. Most of them took place in Ukraine. Some of them were centered in Ukraine. I think more Ukrainian Jews died in the Holocaust than any other number, except I think for the Poles. It was an enormous territory of disaster during the war. I've watched, for 20 years, I've watched Ukraine try to rebuild itself as a society. There have been a lot of ups and downs. It's funny, I tend to show up there, now I'm there quite often, but I would show up there periodically, and of course every time there would be a change and a difference, and I would watch the nature of the society changed. And I was involved as an observer and a kind of cheerleader, watching Ukraine over the last 2 or 3 years first negotiate its association agreement, which, by the way, goes back some years now, and then find itself forced to fight for it. So this is, I think, right now the only country in Europe which has actually shed blood for the European ideal. In February of 2014, starting in November of 2013, when a Ukrainian, profoundly corrupt and undemocratic Ukrainian president tried to take the agreement away from Ukraine, younger Ukrainians, and not only younger, several generations of Ukrainians went out on the street. They defended a set of ideas and ideals. They thought they were fighting against corruption, for the rule of law, for a more open society, for the right to be part of Europe in a cultural sense. I don't think anybody in Ukraine imagines they'll join the European Union anytime soon, but to become part of the European continent in a deeper way. They fought for that. Some of them died for it. They waved European flags on the square of central Kiev. And when their president finally ran away, literally fleeing the country, out of fear of the size of the rebellion, I've watched them try and put the country together again and put it back on a European course. And it hasn't been entirely successful. It goes up and down. As I said, there's a long history of trauma there. There's 100 years of dictatorship that have to be overcome, and therefore ways of thinking and behaving that have to be changed. But when you add up what's been done, when you look at the pockets of success, when you look at the young people creating new television stations and founding new businesses, all you can do is admire them and think, wow, this is something that we have to help. And to discover that, in the Netherlands, that story hasn't been told and isn't well understood, and that a very peculiar referendum with odd origins is about to be voted on that seeks to deny Ukrainians an agreement which for them represents rule of law, democracy, trade, and prosperity, seems to me just extraordinary. I'm hoping maybe you'll tell me in the course of the conversation what's happened inside Dutch society. A vote for this referendum is a vote for rule of law, and a vote against it is a vote for chaos, war, and violence, of a kind that you know perfectly well, because that was what it was that kind of disorder and that kind of catastrophe that brought down the plane that killed so many of your citizens 2 years ago. Why would the Dutch, of all people, vote for chaos, which is in effect what you're doing if you vote against an agreement that Ukrainians hope will build a deeper relationship to Europe? One of the things that I work on when I'm not working on Ukraine, I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years doing, is trying to understand, and at a small think tank that I work in London, trying to track and monitor and get a better insight into the nature of modern disinformation. We look at not only we look at we've looked at ISIS, we've looked at China, but of course one of my primary concerns has been Russian disinformation. How does it work? What's the nature of it in the modern world? It's obviously we're not in the Cold War anymore, and the kinds of disinformation that Russia puts out is no longer the same thing as Soviet propaganda of the olden days. Most of the time, Russia doesn't try to promote itself or say Russia is great. Instead, what it's trying to do is it's trying to undermine others. It tries to undermine the European Union. It's trying to undermine the democracy in Ukraine. It's trying to undermine institutions which the Kremlin feels to be a threat to its authority and its power in Russia. And the only thing I can conclude by in my attempt to understand what's going on here is that Russian disinformation has been incredibly effective here, which is quite shocking in a stable Western European country with a long tradition of democracy, famous journalists and reputable media. How did this happen? Maybe you'll be able to tell me in the next 45 minutes. I hope so. Anyway, so a roundabout answer both to what drew me to this story. I'm drawn to the story of this region because I was initially drawn to a desire to understand dictatorship. And since then, I've remained part of it because I've been trying to understand how you recreate democracy. And suddenly I find myself, those interests have landed me here talking about your very strange referendum. And so I hope we can pursue it further.
Yes, there are a lot of things maybe we could try to answer, maybe with your help as well, to about the Dutch situation. But before we go into that, I'd like to ask you a few more things on your insights on that region and on Ukraine. You've written for several years now opinion pieces or columns on it. In one you're saying this is not a geographical divide. in Ukraine. Ukraine is often been portrayed, because that's maybe one of the problems here in Holland. It's a far-off country we know nothing about. You know, not too long ago we didn't even know that the country existed. Was it called the Ukraine? Was it called Ukraine? It was considered sort of a region.
It was a colony for many centuries.
Yeah,
yes.
and it didn't really appear to us as I mean, it was a region within, you know, Russia or Soviet Union or. So now it's been portrayed often as yes, but it's more or less a conflict between the east and the western Ukraine, because the western Ukraine is more Austrian, more Donau monarchy, more. And the eastern part is more Russian, and it actually belongs to Russia. So you have this clash between people who speak Ukrainian, people who speak Russian. But if I understand you correct, you're saying no, that's not really the case.
No, it's much more complicated than that. So Ukraine is a bilingual country. And it's genuinely bilingual. I had this conversation this morning with the Ukrainian ambassador, who was switching between Ukrainian and Russian on the phone. And he says, well, when people speak Russian to me, I speak back Russian. When they speak Ukrainian, I speak Ukrainian. Most people in the country speak both languages. I've been to public meetings in Kiev like this one, where people get up and one person speaks one and then the other speaks the other. I'd say 95% of people understand both. And so it's deeply bilingual in a way that actually, you know, this is something Americans find very hard to understand, but Europeans should be able to understand. There are other bilingual countries in Europe, and there are other places where people speak more than one language very easily. There is a divide in Ukraine, but the divide isn't linguistic and it isn't national. There is a civilizational argument, and you're right. There has historically been a divide between people who would like to be part of Western civilization, and by that, their understanding of that is, you know, I'm repeating myself now, but rule of law, you know, less corruption, democracy, you know, and so on. And then there is a part of the country that has, after long affiliation with Russia, and after having effectively been a colony of Russia since the 18th century, and before that belonging to Poland, after so many centuries of being a colony, still feels, you know, feudal attachments to Russia, or there are many people who have, you know, who work in companies that belong to Russia, or feel, in any case, afraid to break away from Russia. So there has been this civilizational divide. It has nothing to do with what language you speak at all, and it's not a national or an ethnic divide. But what's really happened in Ukraine, the first sign of it was the Orange Revolution in 2004, and since 2014 you've seen this even more strongly, is this civilizational divide begins to disappear. And there's more and more unified feeling that we would like to be part of the West. And by this, once again, for the third time, it doesn't mean they're going to be in the EU or they're going to be in NATO, but they would like to be part of Western civilization. They would like a relationship with the West. And there is, you would have a hard time now finding in Kiev lots of, or throughout most of Ukraine, lots of people who feel really strongly against this association agreement. I mean, this is very much a policy of the government, you know, by the elected politicians. It's actually been the policy of every government. It was just that Yanukovych's government was temporarily bribed into turning it down.
You would say he was bribed in turning it down?
Oh no, I mean that's not a disputable. You know, he negotiated. Actually, it was his government who negotiated the agreement.
Yeah.
They were very close to signing it, and then very abruptly he suddenly announced we aren't signing it, and it turned out. I mean, depends which figures. There were some figures offered over the table and maybe some under the table. He was offered a sort of, you know, gas price deal to not sign it, and he said, all right, I'm not signing it. And this is when you had a mass protest of a kind that really was quite extraordinary and which lasted for many weeks.
Yeah,
and so that's it. And the interesting thing about this protest, it wasn't just a few people on the square. It lasted for a long time. It was coordinated and organized. Lots of people, you know, sort of middle-class people who had jobs who couldn't go and stand on the square every day, did things like help organize the food to keep people supplied there. There were people who organized transportation for demonstrators to bring them in and out of Kiev. So there was actually, even what you saw was only the was only the most obvious part of really a large social network that grew up around the Maidan and in support of the Maidan. So there was really large and broad national support for what is, in fact, a trade agreement of a kind that the EU has with many other countries. It has with Algeria, it has with Turkey, it has with many others. But for the Ukrainians, it has enormous symbolic significance. This is a trade agreement, okay, it's about sort of raspberry quotas, and my favorite line in the trade agreement, which I have read parts of, it's that thick, so I can't say I've read it.
350 pages or something.
I know, and dense.
Yeah.
But my favorite line in it is a line about, it says that any beverage sold in Ukraine, which is called champagne, has to be from the province of Champagne.
In France.
In France, and
Yeah.
this is,
Yeah.
you know who put that in the agreement.
Monsieur Hollande.
So this is an agreement that was negotiated with multiple European countries, and the idea was to create the basis for a more deeper trading partnership.
Yeah.
So that people would, stand on the streets for days and days and days for that. This tells you how important Europe is symbolically and culturally for Ukrainians.
So you're saying, yes, it's a trade agreement. 300 pages out of the 350 something are about trade. There are a few pages, several, more than 40 or something, which are not on trade but on other strategic stuff. But you're saying, yes, it's a trade agreement, but to Ukrainians it's much more.
Yes, because it represents to Ukrainians the overcoming of this civilizational divide. We want to be part of Western civilization. And again, by that, they don't mean they want to be in the EU. They mean they want Western rule of law. They want to end the rule of corrupt oligarchs. Yeah. They want accountability. They want democracy. They want their politicians to listen to them. And they don't want to be, treated like slaves or like citizens of an authoritarian dictatorship.
Yeah, but what's your take on... because then a lot of people say, yes, well, that's all very well, but there are, in fact, such huge fascist factions among the people who like to be part of our so-called rule of law, democracy, Western ideals. These people are not part of it. We shouldn't even go near them. We don't even want to touch them at all. What's your take on that?
So there is a tiny far right in Ukraine which did very badly in the last elections, and I would guess, and I don't think it's even a guess, I think we could do it statistically, that it's a lot smaller than the fascist fringe here. The existence of far-right parties is now a cross-European phenomenon. It's very strong in France. It's growing in Germany. It's incredibly strong in Hungary. It exists even in some places where you couldn't have imagined it a few years ago, like Sweden. The fact is that in Ukraine, it's less influential and less important there than it is in many Western European countries.
Yeah. But then there are these, I would tend to agree with you, on percentage-wise. But on the other hand, there's a war going on in the east of it.
There is a war.
And some of those people are actually fighting there. You have this Azov battalion who has openly swastikas on them. And they've been even incorporated into what you could call sort of an official Ministry of Interior Affairs fighting company. So, how do we have to look upon that?
So when you have violence of that kind, which you haven't had in this part of Europe in 60 years, violence creates and breeds extremism, and there are extremist groups who fight with the Ukrainian army, but they don't run the country, they don't dictate policy, they don't control politics, they don't have a role in the political debate in Kiev. I think you would discover if the Netherlands were to go to war against, the Belgians, you would find extreme...
We did actually once.
You did, right, okay. Well, if you were to do it again... If you were to do it again, you would discover that on both sides of the border, you would have a rise in violent extremism, because that's what wars do. And one of the other reasons why Ukraine would like to be associated with the West and part of the West is that it doesn't want wars like this. It would like to be a stronger country, It would like to be a more prosperous country. What's the way to become more prosperous? You need to trade, you need to develop, you need investment, you need, you need political stability. And it's only by having trade and investment and political stability that they will be able to withstand another invasion of the kind they had in 2014.
Yeah. So you would say that's partly because of there is a war going on. It breeds extremism.
If you want the extremism to end, and as I say, you should maybe think about ending it here as well. But if you want extremism to end in Ukraine, then the way to do it is to trade with Ukraine and to ensure Ukraine's prosperity and stability. If the war continues, if Russia invades further, then you will have you could have in eastern Ukraine an expansion of this zone of instability. And again, I'm repeating myself again, but it was this zone of instability, the lack of order, which led to the situation which brought down MH17.
Yeah. And so,
and which proving, by the way, that Ukraine is not as far away as you thought it was. Okay, it's not your direct neighbor, but we now live in a global world, and we have airplanes, and we have the internet, and we have cyber warfare, and it's no longer possible to say, right, we're Dutch, and we live here, and we can build walls all around us, and we can keep other people out and other ideas out, and they can live over there, and they're not our problem. No, it's Ukraine is your problem whether you want it to be or not. And by the way, so is Syria, but we can talk about that another time.
Well, there's a lot of parallels, of course, with what could happen actually in the Ukraine. If you see how
would you like a civil war of that scale on your eastern border now that you've got one on your southern border? I didn't think so.
It's not very good now. But would you say that's exaggerated? Of course, we don't want another Syria on our eastern border between Russia and the EU, on the Polish border. But is that an option?
So right at this minute, no. If you'd asked me, 2 years ago in the spring and summer of 2014, I was worried about it. Yes. The Russian government has now made clear that it doesn't feel bound by sort of a 50-year tradition, including a post-Cold War tradition, Cold War and post-Cold War tradition of not moving boundaries in Europe. It's made clear that it isn't bothered by that. It doesn't mind doing that. As I say, it's been conducting very aggressive information campaigns and political financing campaigns in its neighboring countries and also in Western Europe. It's showing that it doesn't respect the kinds of boundaries that we have come to expect in Europe. And so, yes, I think you have to take seriously the idea that they might at some later stage want to expand the war. They decided not to 2 years ago. They decided to confine it to Donbass. But it's not inconceivable that it could be expanded further in the future.
And then there is a lot of misunderstanding about the relationships of the Ukrainians towards the Russians. I mean, you have written on the Gulag. You have how the whole story about the Ukrainians being suppressed by the Russians. Would it be fair to say that the murder of between 2 and 5 million Ukrainian farmers in the 30s would that go down as a Russian genocide on Ukrainians, or is that more a Soviet thing which they did? To everybody who's living in the Soviet Union. How? So
you've just allowed me to do a little advertisement for my next book, which is about this very about this very subject, about the 20s and 30s in Ukraine. And it's a complicated story, and you'll have to wait for the book to come out if you want to hear the whole thing.
So we have a cliffhanger here.
You have a cliffhanger, but no, I can say that the short version is that yes, there was there was Soviet oppression, throughout the Soviet Union, and it's true that the collectivization in 1929 and 30 was followed by food shortages and famines all over the country. But it's also true that within the general famine, there was a specific set of actions that were taken in Ukraine. Very specifically in the autumn of 1932, that were designed to both eliminate a part of the Ukrainian peasantry and also to eliminate the Ukrainian intellectual and cultural elite. And they were very specific to do with not just the disorganization of collectivization, but the actual removal of food from peasants' houses. So there were collection teams that went around villages and took all the food away. And then a few weeks later, there was a kind of cordon set up around Ukraine, so people couldn't leave. So, if you don't have any food and you're not allowed to leave the territory of the Republic to get any, you starve. And that is what happened to, the numbers are very hard to calculate. I think the best ones are between 3 and 4 million. 3 and 4 million people died, and the reason for it was I won't say Russian, I will say this was a Soviet desire to eliminate the possibility of a nationalist or anti-Soviet revolution in Ukraine. The idea was to take the heart and take the sort of guts out of the Ukrainian national movement, which came from the peasantry, and to physically eliminate it. As most people don't know, there was an independent Ukrainian state in 1917.
Just during the revolution.
Just after the revolution, and there was a terrible civil war. Probably the most violent part of the civil war in Russia took place, or the Russian Civil War took place in Ukraine, and the Bolsheviks knew that, and the Bolsheviks were anxious about something like that happening again. And so the desire to eliminate both the Ukrainian peasants and, as I say, simultaneously, the intellectuals was absolutely a deliberate policy.
So you could speak of a genocidal attempt to get rid of the nationalist identity.
To get rid of the nationalist identity. Not all Ukrainians, but of Ukrainians associated with the national identity, and that was Soviet policy in the early 1930s. And it was for a long time. It was successful in the sense that they did.
If you kill a few million people,
you can scare everybody else.
Yeah. And effectively, you've probably killed most intelligentsia.
They made an attempt to kill or destroy or eliminate, one way or the other, most of the Ukrainian historians, Ukrainian writers, Ukrainian politicians, even Ukrainian school teachers were the focus of one of the purges in that.
And one of the root causes of that was the Bolshevik fear of what happened in the Civil War, the whites against the reds.
The Bolshevik fear and the Bolshevik desire for total control. We're now in history. I don't believe that the current Russian regime has exactly the same aim. So I don't want to make a parallel. But if you want to talk about history, yes, the Bolsheviks had a belief that only they should have. That they had a monopoly on power and that they had a monopoly on ideas, and they also attempted to control every lever of the state. So not just politics and not just economics, but culture, education, history. That's what totalitarianism was. They didn't always succeed. They didn't always manage to control everything, but that was the goal of that system. And the Ukrainian revival that took place in the early 1990s, and the ones that have periodically risen their heads again since then, have often been not openly, you can't be anti-Soviet anymore, but have been very much an attempt to put back together the society. It's not an accident that they talk about civil society so much in Ukraine. This wasn't something that we imported. Civil society was the thing that the Soviet Union destroyed, and thus civil society is the thing that's missing there, and in Russia, actually. And by civil society, I mean all kinds of organizations, all kinds of non-government institutions, all kinds of independent movements and independent ways of thinking. And putting that back together again is part of what the Orange Revolution was about, and it's part of what the Maidan was about in 2014. So again, we see an anti-government protest, but Ukrainians experience that, as I say, it was much deeper than what you saw on the square. It was all kinds of people working together, and new television stations being created right for that moment. There's a famous online television station that began and was launched during the protests, which is now trying to establish itself as one of the main TV stations in Ukraine. So these have been really civic movements more than anything else, and they are civic movements designed to address the damage that was done to the country during the 20th century.
Yeah, because yes, we're delving into history, which is a history which is not very well known here. We had Timothy Schneider here not too long ago.
He knows that history.
He wrote extensively on Bloodlands. It's a very impressive book. But in Holland, that part of we know about the Holocaust. We don't know about the starvation of the Ukrainians.
No.
So I'm to bring that in again, because a lot of people say, first ask you another question, because in one of your columns I saw you writing about maybe the oligarchs after 1989, in the past 20 years, well, they enriched themselves, but maybe they didn't build enough nationalism. Is that why you're stressing that? Because it's cohesion of a country.
So I tried to make a few months ago, a year or two, I tried to make a perverse argument about Ukraine in the context of this discussion and debate about nationalism and patriotism. And I argued that the real problem in Ukraine, my experience in Ukraine over 2 decades, is not that Ukraine is full of fascists and full of nationalists. I mean, there are a few, and they've been quite visible at times. The real problem is the lack of nationalism and the lack of national identity, which makes people cynical. It makes people corrupt. If you don't feel any loyalty to your state, and you don't feel that these people who run you have anything to do with you, and you don't care really what happens to them, then you're in a situation, well, okay, I can cheat my neighbor and I can break the law because these aren't really my laws and I don't care. So we again, in Western Europe, we often forget that our societies came, when we became democracies at a moment when our national identity was very strong and important, one of the reasons why democracy works in a place like the Netherlands is that people feel some loyalty to their country, so they participate in politics, so they vote in elections, they you go and cheer your football team. I mean, people participate in public life because they feel part of a society. And if you actually had a situation in Ukraine in the early 1990s where lots of people didn't particularly feel part of what was going on, that, the Soviets left and some corrupt guys took over and we didn't really know who they are, and, the voting system was a little strange and people didn't feel an attachment to the country. And that was part of why it was as weak as it was for so long. And one of the other things that's changing, I wouldn't say everywhere in Ukraine, but you can certainly feel it in Kiev and the central and western part of the country, and even Odessa, you can feel people beginning to feel, wait, this is my country, I care what happens to it. I'm going to vote in the elections, I'm going to participate in the political process because, I belong here and I'm part of it. And it's when people don't have that feeling that you have, you get social breakdown.
Yeah. I see your argument. And if you again back to the 30s, no, it's not Putin's policy to repeat that or whatever. But a lot of people would argue, especially around here, at the moment very vocally, well, it's the Russian sphere of influence anyway. So, what are we bothering there? It's dangerous, provoking the bear, or it's not fair, or it's, it's been Russia forever. What are we poking our noses in something?
Well, first of all, we aren't poking our noses. It's the Ukrainians who have asked for this agreement, and the Ukrainians who've negotiated it, and the Ukrainians who want the relationship with Europe. Nobody in the EU is forcing Ukraine to have a trade agreement. There's no constituency for that. And the EU actually, my recollection of events, which is quite clear, is that the Maidan demonstrations and this waving of EU flags and so on came as a total shock to the European Union, which was completely unprepared for it and had no idea it was coming, and had no, certainly at the highest levels, the European Commission and so on, was unprepared for it. So far from imposing Europe on Ukraine, what we see is something quite different. We see the Ukrainians clamoring to be part of Europe, or not part of Europe, but part of the broader, by definition, European civilization. And we see surprised Europeans not knowing what to do, or in the case of many in the Netherlands, wanting to reject them. So I didn't see where this idea of European colonialism is coming from.
That's actually the word which is used, yes, often.
This is a country which is trying to escape from 300 years of Russian colonialism.
Right.
Which is what's happening in front of our eyes. The presence of Europe is very light in Ukraine and not felt nearly enough. And the Ukrainians would like there to be more. They would like more European investment. They would like a greater a greater presence of Europe. And, in fact, at the moment, what Europe's role in Ukraine is tiny.
But then you could say, well, yes, that's all very well, but politics, it's the Russian influence sphere anyway. We should not provoke them. It's only. I'm
not even sure I understand the argument. So we've had for 20 years.
I'm not too sure myself, but
okay. So I'm just saying, for 20 years, we've had a situation where people. I sometimes hear people say, "Well, shouldn't Ukraine be Finlandized, or shouldn't it be a bridge between East and West?"
Yeah,
well,
Central Europe.
That's what it's
Europa.
been. That is actually the role that it has played for the last 25 years. It is that. It has been a bridge. It has been neither East nor West. It has not had its own identity. And what has been the result? As I say, profound corruption, cynicism, and now, the emergence of violence in the East. It has not been successful to have Ukraine as a sort of, playground for Russian oligarchs. That has been an unsuccessful model. It hasn't worked for Ukraine. It hasn't been good for Ukraine's neighbors. It hasn't made Ukraine rich, and it hasn't made Ukraine stable. So we've done that experiment, and it didn't succeed. It did not work. And so what Ukraine would like now is something different.
But that's about Ukraine, and then it's about the Russian interest. I mean, this is a big country, a big nuclear country. They have their interests as well. They're terrified by being surrounded by us, by being isolated on their continent, no access to waters. They need their bases in Sebastopol as well.
They have their bases in Sebastopol. I mean, the bases in Sebastopol have been agreed to them, were agreed with them a long time ago. There were bases in Sebastopol were never in doubt. I mean, I think the Russian problem is I would put it a little bit differently. So yes, I do think Putin fears the West, or is concerned about the West as such. But I don't think it's a military concern. All he has to do is look at how many American tanks there are in Europe, and note that a few years ago, actually, there were none. Now they've brought a few back, although not very many. What Putin is afraid of, and this is true, he is afraid of the West as a successful set of institutions, which could be attractive to Russians. So he is afraid of Western democracy, and he is afraid of Western prosperity, and he is afraid of Western culture, because these things are strong. When these things are strong, they are attractive to Russians.
And they threaten his rule.
And they threaten his rule, which is authoritarian and nepotistic and kleptocratic and based on a system of corrupt relationships, which is, yes, it is a different system from ours. And so, yes, he's worried that his form of corruption can be undermined if people in his country feel attracted to something else. And this, of course, is why Maidan was so threatening, because that is his nightmare, that, people waving European flags in Red Square.
Yeah.
That, yes, he's worried about it, but he's not worried about it because it's a danger to his country. It would be good for his country. And he's worried about it because it's a danger to him.
It would be bad for him, though.
And his friends, who are in control of the levers of power in Russia right now. But let's think about, and incidentally, his reaction, unlike ours, has not been to say, okay, I don't want these ideas, I'm building walls and I'm not letting people in. No, his reaction has been aggressive. So his reaction to what this perceived threat of the West has been to try to undermine the West. And how does he do that? This is
what you've been studying at the Legatum Institute. You were just mentioning. I was going to get back to that.
He is funding anti-European political parties in the West, either funding or advising or helping in other ways. I mean, we know about Marine Le Pen and we know about Jobbik in Hungary, but he has strong relationships with other anti-European parties, both of the far right and the far left, in almost all European countries. He funds media operations in every Western country, including both social media and standard media. He funds think tanks and websites which promote Russian ideas. Not that they promote Russian ideas, but they attempt to undermine European ideas, anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-American, in some countries anti-establishment. And he also works through the business community looking for links to powerful companies who can promote, his view of the world inside the halls of power. And different aspects of this work differently in different countries. The relationship with rich people works very well in Italy.
Around Berlusconi.
Yeah, and not only, but so and it's not the same tactic everywhere. But the funding of and the support for anti-European movements is something he does in every country.
And is he so good at that? I mean, the Russians tend not to be that good at that.
It doesn't take very much effort. It doesn't take a lot of money. It's a small amount of a little bit of funding from Marine Le Pen keeps her party going. It's not a great. It doesn't require great skill or tactics.
It works though.
It's not clear to me yet that it will work in the long run, but that's the point about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union also had a plot to overthrow Europe and make everybody communist, and that didn't work, right? But it did a certain amount of damage along the way. There was damage that was done, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also elsewhere, and this will have the same effect.
Mm-hmm. You were mentioning tanks. We don't have any left. The Dutch sold actually all of them. Actually, just recently we are leasing back. I mean, some of them are, but the only ones who kept them were the Poles in Europe.
A few other people have them, but yeah.
Yeah, but in sort of a little bit bigger numbers. And by the way, coincidentally, you are married to the former foreign minister of Poland, Radisław Sikorski. Mm-hmm. Would you say that it would be advisable to rearm and be able to resist a Russian onslaught on?
Well, theoretically, I mean, and I hope we can
have
the former NATO Secretary General emphasize this point better than me. But no, what is the point of NATO? The point of NATO is that it is not an aggressive organization; it's a deterrent, and that's what it's always been. It's not there to invade Russia. We have no interest in doing that. It's there to prevent Russia from invading us, and theoretically, it still does that. And so, yes, it needs some weapons, and it needs some. And it's historically had a large American presence to reinforce it as a way of preventing Russia and others, if need be, from attacking a NATO member. So no, I don't think you can get rid of all the militaries yet altogether, because no, there is still a theoretical military threat that exists and hasn't gone away.
No, so we should not get rid of it. We should maybe buy a little bit more of it.
I think it would. I think in the coming years we are not moving into a more stable period of history, and we are not moving into a more peaceful era of history.
That would be fair. Probably.
And what you want to be is able to deter violence and to deter attack.
Yes, because we have been speaking now on the rights of the Ukrainians, on the ideas and of the rule of law, of the European idea, from that aspect. But of course, there is a geopolitical aspect in associating with Ukraine, or not.
Geopolitical aspect meaning?
Meaning a security aspect.
So there isn't really a security aspect. So for the Ukrainians, there isn't. We haven't given them a security guarantee, and I don't think we're going to. But for the Ukrainians, the agreement is a kind of promise of a relationship. It's not a guarantee. It won't defend them against Russian tanks if more Russian tanks come in. And we aren't promising to do that in any ways. I think for them it represents security in a larger sense. We're part of this larger economic space. We'll be able to have deeper relationships with European companies, with European business people, I think it's more in the very broader sense. It's for them, it makes them feel part of a Western world and Western civilization. But no, I think ultimately the defense of Ukraine will have to be Ukrainian.
But you would say, you would think, though, that it would be nice to have 45 million people more on the European side of history.
So in that sense, yes. If you're worried about, a military or other kind of threat from Russia, then what you really want is a stable and prosperous and relatively integrated Ukraine on your eastern border. That's one of the best guarantees for European peace and European security that you can have.
Yeah. So more in the immaterial sense than in,
Yes.
in the direct military sense. It's a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for all your insights.